The Wylderwood Chapter 3. They entered the large hall, a natural hollow strewn with leaves and flowers and elegant curls of wood and burl. It looked like nothing more than a church dedicated to worshipping nature itself. Nezzy paused for a moment to marvel at its beauty before the press of the crowd urged her ahead. Harks and Lochlan nodded goodbyes and each went to stand with their masters. Nezzy looked at the archdruidess, who turned to catch her eye and smiled. Without a word, Nezzy knew Shelsani would rather have her observing from afar than waiting by her side, so she dipped her head in a bow. She felt bad that she hadn't told Harks the truth about her mother. It just seemed so complicated. Shelsani had left Nezzy with the other druids when she was very young and had only returned for her a year ago. Nezzy understood that her mother was using her magic to protect people, but she'd still missed her. Now that they were back together, there was so much to learn and not much time to just be together. Nezzy had slowed down, lost in her thoughts, but the crowd nudged past her and brought her back to herself. The meeting room was vaulted and circular, with smooth-grown walls closing together overhead like a huge dome. A natural stage was at the center of the room, and seating was spread out in raised organic circles. In some places, pipegrass brought in fresh water to mist down and gather in small pools. All the humans, elves, and dwarves in the audience were sitting on dry benches, but Nezzy decided to stand under the gentle mists with the few Frosker in attendance. She enjoyed the cool water drifting around her like a summer rain. Outside, night was falling, and looking up, she saw bright stars through openings high in the ceiling. She noticed Hark standing unusually straight and rigid beside Bobbadin on the stage, and thought her friend must be upset about something, until she looked over at Lochlan and realized that Harks was perfectly imitating the young squire. Harks must have seen her look, because she winked, and Nezzy almost burst out with a laugh that would have been very inappropriate. To avoid getting herself in trouble, Nezzy looked away from Harks and turned to the important people on the stage. Besides her mentor and those of her friends, there was Osla, the high druid of the Frosker and a great friend of Shelsani's. Gorsen was there, tall and strong, but so tired-looking, like he could never get enough sleep. Kerra Thain, leader of the Rhinotaur kinships, sat on a chair specially made to hold her weight. She was tall, with gray armored skin and huge muscles, and she weighed as much as 10 men. Nezzy recognized Hordenir, the warrior king of Gerachin, whose fierce axemen had escorted the sail train. Beside him sat Sanlosh, the dwarf lord, so old he was gray and still, like he was carved of stone. Sanlosh could no longer lift a warhammer, but his people kept the ogre clans from invading the lowlands, and all the realms were thankful for his leadership. Nezzy started to hum a song that Shelsani had taught her about the mountain magic of the ancient dwarves, but just then, Osla, the Frosker High Druid, rapped his staff lightly on the stage by his feet. In answer, drummers stationed around the edge of the room beat their drums at once, signaling the beginning of the meeting. Nezzy felt her heart leap. It was actually time. Maybe she'd finally learn what was in the coffer. Osla stood up and bowed, once to those on stage and once to the audience.
I welcome all of you to Edgewater. I welcome you to our modest hall, and I welcome you to this meeting, where the great among all our realms sit before you. We have been called here for only one reason, to decide what is to become of the Red Coffer. Gorsen, if you would.
Gorsen the Grave unstrapped the heavy pack that he had carried across the realms and set it before him. The pack was made from the shell of a lava clam, stronger than stone and resistant to magic. He paused, then pressed his fingers into the seam of the shell and heaved. His muscles swelled and he grunted once, and then the halves fell open. Inside sat the Red Coffer. It was smooth scarlet, banded in iron, and it seemed to pulse, like it held some hidden heart. Gorsen laid it in the center of the table. Most of the people on stage stared at it with fear or wonder, but Nezzy noticed that Gorsen dropped into his chair as if suddenly exhausted. Osla continued.
The Red Coffer is the creation of Bobadid the Bright, reinforced by the unmatched steelwork of Sir Ransear the Renowned, and sealed by the magic of our archdruidess Shelsani. The spell that Our Lady set upon this coffer ensured that it could never be opened outside of the Wylderwood, and that only a servant of the spirit of this endless wood would be able to open it. It is the great honor of my life that I am that servant, and I will open the Red Coffer when these great lords and ladies decide the moment is right.
Sir Ransear stood then, raising his voice so that it carried through the hall.
Thank you, Osla. I believe that moment has come. I propose that we examine it here and now while we are all assembled, and be sure the relic is secure in the coffer before we push it into these savage wilds.
There were shocked gasps from the crowd, but Ransear raised his voice over them.
We need to be sure,
he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. Bobadin the Bright spoke up, clearly confused.
Well, but you were there. Gorsen brought it to the three of us, and then...
Ransear shouted over him.
I saw no more than you did. A madman with a bag of dirty sailcloth.
Shelsani spoke then, loudly but calmly. Do you accuse Gorsen the Great of lying? What shadow has fallen upon you, Ransear? Ransear shook his head and matched his tone to hers.
I accuse no one of anything, but we are charged with controlling this power, and we cannot afford to act without knowledge.
He laid his hand on the coffer.
If the item is still inside, then we will destroy it. It's been a long year since we sealed it away. Before I risk my life and the lives of my dear friends, we need to be sure it's still inside.
Gorsen stood up straight, his haggard face angry as a sudden storm and his voice quiet. I carried it out of the desert for you. I brought it to your holy place for you. His fists clenched as he grew louder. And for a year I've carried that curse on my back. When you call me a liar, one of us is dishonored. I lost friends and I lost pieces of myself for it. The only thing I have is my honor, Paladin, and I don't lie. Shelsani touched the back of his hand gently, and he took a deep breath, stopping himself from saying more. For a moment, everything was as quiet as the grave. Sanloge spoke up, the old dwarf trying to ease the tension that gathered like cobwebs in the silence.
No one questions Gorsen, no one, and least of all me. I've fought with him, and there's no finer ogre slayer in the realms. But before I commit my kin and countrymen to a journey into the Wylderwood, I must know the truth. Sir Ransear has convinced me, and I can see no other way to be sure than to do as he has suggested.
Hordenir nodded and called,
Here, here, let us see. There's no harm in it.
Nezzy saw Gorsen's face growing darker and darker. Shelsani kept a hand on his arm, whispering in his ear. In her secret heart, Nezzy felt guilty. She trusted anything that Shelsani trusted, but a part of her wanted her mother and Gorsen to lose this argument. She wanted the Red Coffer open so she could see what was inside. Kerra Thain spoke with clear anger in her voice.
Gorsen is a warrior of honor, and Ransear is not speaking like a man of honor at all. I believe Gorsen. Still, Sanloge speaks true. All of us must rely on proof even more than our belief in one another. Open the box, and let us find the truth of this and be done with it.
Sir Ransear gave a sly smirk, and Shelsani sighed deeply. Fine, the Archdruidess said, defeated. If that is the will of this group, then let it be so. Open the coffer and we will see the power it holds. And then we can get on with our real task, bringing this evil to the Dawn Tree where its power can be safely released, its death trapped by the life of the Wylderwood. Ransear bowed his head.
Oh, we must heed your words, O wise one.
Gorsen's eyes blazed with rage and he shook his head briefly, but offered no more argument. Shelsani nodded to Osla. The Frosker paused a moment, looking intently at each of the great men and women around the table with him. Then, spreading his webbed fingers, he laid his hand on the red coffer and closed his eyes. A light breeze swirled in the room, though no doors or windows stood open. Nezzy could feel the druid reaching out to the Wylderwood, and to her surprise, she could hear the Wylderwood's answering power, like water springing from a newly struck well. The yellow spots on Osla's arms and forehead grew bright as his magic surged. The spots echoed themselves in the air, flashing firebugs of magic. With a final shouted syllable, the wind ceased, and the red coffer opened with a creak. Nezzy craned her neck to see, along with the rest of the room. Inside, there was a dirty bag, the shape of something vaguely square inside.
Now, said Sir Ransear, let us see the book.
Gorsen scowled and reached for the bag. Suddenly, the iron bands along the coffer, the ones Ransear had forged, burst into a dazzling light. It was so bright, Nezzy feared she'd been struck blind. A noise like a charging army rang from the coffer, filling the dome and vibrating into the earth, and then went silent. Nezzy blinked, her vision slowly returning. She looked to Shelsani, who met her eye and frowned. That frown meant Shelsani was surprised by the coffer's outburst, surprised and worried. Nezzy felt her skin prickle. If Shelsani was worried, Nezzy was terrified.
What was that?
Gorsen snarled at Sir Ransear. And it was right then that the world exploded. With an endless, deafening roar, the floor erupted as a huge pitworm smashed up through the wood, through the stage, and out through the natural ceiling. It was hundreds of feet long and easily a dozen thick, with hard gray scales and a hideous, clawing beak for burrowing through the earth. Nezzy had heard tales of such beasts living deep in the Wylderwood, but now she was screaming as it stood in front of her and then came crashing back down sideways, taking an entire side of the domed room with it. Wood splintered and people screamed and Frosker howled and rubble splashed and the creature roared again, making the world feel small. "Oh, what do I do?" Nezzy pleaded to no one. "What do I do?" Those gathered at the table had been tossed in all directions, and much of the crowd was lost in smoke and rubble. Nezzy looked for her master, for her friends, and couldn't find them in the commotion. The giant, eyeless head of the pitworm snaked towards the broken stage, and Nezzy saw Bobbidin the Bright, dazed but sitting, with his back to the beast. She wanted to cry out, but couldn't make herself speak. She wanted to reach out with her magic, but what would work best? She thought that she might be able to call up roots from the broken floor to try and trap the thing, but she second-guessed herself, and the magic failed in her hands. Her heart sank. She'd frozen like this so many times before. In training, it was so easy to do whatever her teachers asked of her, but she got nervous when she had to decide for herself what to do. The wyrm bore down on Bobbidin, who was still shaking himself awake. Finally, Nezzy screamed, and then Gorsen the Great was there. He charged the head of the monster and slashed at it with his famous sword, driving it back and rearing into the air. Bobbidin stood up, and Nezzy saw the wizard's usually friendly face was curled in rage. He drew a burning rune in the air and then cast it at the pitworm, pushing it backwards with another terrible roar. Something crashed into Nezzy from the side, making her wheeze. She looked up to see Gorsen, who had tackled her just as the worm's deadly tail whipped overhead. "You have to watch both ends!" he shouted, looking more natural in the midst of battle than she'd ever seen him. "Get out of here, before it gets worse," he said. Then he leapt away, sword in hand, rushing back to the fight. Bobbit the Bright had gotten his bearings and gathered his magical power. He flicked his wrist at the pitworm and called out something in a tongue Nezzy didn't recognize. A blue wave of magic rippled from the old man, and Nezzy was rocked by its power. When it washed over the worm, the beast was instantly turned to stone, half in the ground and half out, the wood crumbling to splinters at its base. The roaring stopped, but the crowd kept shouting, and screams could be heard all over the city. Rubble rained down and water shot from broken pipegrass, soaking everything. Gorsen clapped Bobbit on the back and picked his way through the mess. He scooped up the Red Coffer and set it back in his lava shell pack. Nezzy shook herself and looked for her mother. She spotted Harks helping the archdruidess to her feet. "Shalsani!" she cried, running towards them. "Harks!" A lump of dark shadow hit the ground between them, and then another and another. They stretched like spiders and unfurled into crude figures, shaped like small humans holding weapons, with limbs of dead wood and joints of moss and fungus. They chittered for a moment and then swarmed forward, attacking everyone with reckless abandon. Nezzy instinctively reached out to them, tapping her druid training to feel the connection to nature, and she almost threw up. These things were made of plant matter, but it had been corrupted somehow. Even as the creatures fought, the vines and flowers that littered the floor around them wilted and died wherever they touched. "Dross!" Nezzy hissed, remembering Shalsani's songbook. From rotted trunk, from fallen tree, from vile vine and misery, when darkness steals from nature's hand, beware the foe ripped from the land, beware the branch and morbid moss, beware the creeping dreadful Dross. Nezzy started to shake. Dross were deadly creatures, born of dark magic. They stole the life from nature and used it to fuel themselves, and now they were falling from everywhere and nowhere. A dark tempest, an endless rain, and Nezzy screamed, adrift in the storm. To be continued. Thanks for listening!